Winnie the Pooh had never felt so comfortable in all his life. The gentle rustling of the leaves outside the 100-acre wood made a soft, soothing sound. A slight breeze crept through the window, bringing with it the scent of honey and fresh grass. Inside the little house, Pooh Bear sat nestled in his favorite armchair, a mug of warm honey tea cradled in his hands. The room was bathed in a soft, golden glow from the flickering fireplace. Pooh sighed contentedly, sinking deeper into the plush cushions. The peacefulness of the evening made him feel safe, cozy, and drowsy. Outside, the night was falling, but inside, the warmth and quiet felt like an eternal embrace. Soft, sleepy music hummed from the nearby record player, its lullaby-like melody floating through the room. The notes were delicate, almost like the fluttering wings of a butterfly. With each passing moment, Pooh's eyelids grew heavier, the tea in his paws cooling, forgotten. But as he began to drift into a light slumber, something shifted. A cold draft swept through the room, brushing the back of his neck. It was sudden and unnatural, like the wind itself had become a strange, eerie presence. Pooh's fur stood on end. The music from the record player slowed, then stuttered, as though something had interrupted its flow. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the chill remained, thicker now, as if the air itself had turned cold and heavy. The comforting sounds of the woods outside began to fade, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. Pooh looked around, his heart starting to race. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, stretching longer than they should. A chill ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. The warmth from the fire seemed to flicker, dimming, as if something was blocking its glow. Pooh's gaze darted toward the window. The woods were dark, but not the peaceful kind of darkness he was used to. This was different. It felt watching. His breathing quickened, and his grip on the mug tightened. The sleepy music suddenly stopped. A brief, sharp silence filled the room before the record player clicked, its needle moving on its own. A low, distorted whisper came from the speakers. "Winnie!" Pooh froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper repeated, growing louder, closer. "Winnie!" Pooh felt a cold shiver race down his spine. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room, trying to find the source of the voice. But all he saw was the soft flicker of the fire, the shadows that had somehow grown darker, deeper. The air thickened, the silence stretched longer, and Pooh could feel a presence looming behind him. A presence that should not have been there. He wanted to run, but his body refused to move. The air felt like it was pushing him down, forcing him to remain still, to listen. Another whisper came, this time more distinct. "Winnie!" Pooh's breath hitched. This was no ordinary night. Something was wrong, and he didn't know how much longer he could stay safe in the cozy little house, where shadows now seemed to linger, watching him. The silence seemed to stretch forever, but Pooh could feel his heart pounding louder with each passing second. The whisper, now unmistakable, seemed to come from every direction. It was as if the very walls of the house were speaking his name. "Winnie!" He turned slowly, his gaze snapping from corner to corner, desperately searching for the source. Nothing. The room was still, too still. The fire flickered once more, casting fleeting shadows that danced erratically across the walls. Pooh's paws were clammy against the mug, his fingers trembling. His stomach twisted in knots, as if something deep inside him knew the danger was closer than he could understand. Suddenly, there was a soft creak from the wooden floor. Pooh froze. The sound was unmistakable. Something was moving. He could hear it now, the faint scuffling of something dragging itself across the floor. It was slow, deliberate, like a claw scraping against the surface. Pooh's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing. What was it? The sound came again, closer this time. He wanted to call for help, but his voice was trapped inside his chest. He stood, shakily, unable to control the trembling that had overtaken his body. His eyes darted around, and he could feel the temperature drop even further, as if the very essence of the room had become chilled to the core. The shadows in the corners stretched, curling inward toward him like tendrils reaching out. Pooh took a step back, his legs unsteady, his mind fighting to understand what was happening. The air was so thick now, it was suffocating. Suddenly, the whisper came again, this time not from the speakers, but right behind him. Winney. He spun around in shock, his heart hammering in his chest. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the cold, oppressive darkness. And then, in the dim light, something moved, a shape, shifting just beyond the fire's reach. It was small at first, like a shadow stretching. Then it grew larger, impossibly large, as if the darkness itself was expanding. Pooh's breath quickened, his eyes wide in terror. The air around him seemed to close in, heavy with a presence he couldn't explain. His chest tightened, and he stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of his armchair. The shadow flickered, and for a brief moment, Pooh could see it clearly, something tall, looming, its form vaguely human but wrong, twisted. It was silent now, its very existence more oppressive than the terrifying whispers that filled the room. Pooh's eyes locked onto it, frozen in place, unable to look away. It was as if the shadow knew him, knew everything about him. The longer Pooh stared, the more he felt it draw closer. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. His mind screamed for him to escape, to find the door, to leave this nightmare. But the room was shrinking, closing in on him. And then, the whisper came again, louder, sharper, and this time, it wasn't just his name. It was a command. Come. The word echoed in the silence, reverberating in his bones. The shadow began to move toward him, its movements unnatural, sliding like a liquid. It reached for him, and Pooh felt a cold, clammy hand brush against his fur. The moment it touched him, a wave of ice-cold fear washed over him. It wasn't just cold, it was ancient, an unnatural coldness that seeped into his very soul. His mind screamed, and for the first time, Pooh could move. He stumbled back, knocking over the tea mug, the warm honey spilling across the floor in an eerie splash. But there was no time for that. He had to run. He turned toward the door, his paws scrambling to open it, but the handle was stuck. The shadow was closing in, its presence overwhelming, its cold touch now seeping into his very bones. His heart raced. The room felt smaller, tighter. Pooh could hear the whispers growing louder, louder still. Come. He was being pulled in, drawn toward the presence that had taken over his home. He had to get out. But the door wouldn't budge. The walls were closing in. Pooh's breath came in ragged gasps as he yanked desperately at the door, his paws slick with sweat. The handle wouldn't turn. The darkness around him seemed to pulse like a living thing, pushing against him, suffocating him with its icy grip. The shadows were everywhere now, twisting and contorting, stretching toward him with unnatural speed. The whisper grew louder, sharper, as if the very air was filled with it, surrounding him. Come. It was no longer a request. It was a command. Pooh could feel the presence, this thing, this darkness, growing closer, its cold fingers brushing his fur. He could almost taste the fear in the air, thick and sharp, clogging his throat. His eyes darted frantically around the room. The furniture was distorted now, warped and alien, as if the very space had twisted to fit the presence that was invading it. Everything felt wrong. The shadows had a life of their own, reaching out with tendrils that curled like serpents. With one final, desperate cry, Pooh flung himself at the door, using all his strength to pull and twist the handle. It refused to move. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. The whisper was deafening now, so loud that it seemed to fill his mind, his very soul. Come. It was everywhere. Pooh closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but the sound echoed through his skull, vibrating with an awful intensity. The shadow was right behind him now, too close, its cold presence creeping over him like a winter storm. He could feel its breath, icy, ragged, on the back of his neck. Come. He had no choice. With a final, terrified push, Pooh broke free from the door, stumbling forward into the cold night air outside. The wind hit him like a slap in the face, its chill biting through his fur. He looked back, but the door was already closed behind him, the little house standing silent, as if nothing had happened at all. But Pooh knew better. He could feel the shadow following him, its presence still looming, just out of sight. The music from inside the house had stopped, replaced by the silence of the night. But that silence was filled with something else, something dark, something alive. He turned and ran, his paws pounding on the dirt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast he ran, the chill never left. The whisper never stopped. Come. Pooh's legs burned as he ran, the cold wind biting at his face, his heart pounding in his chest. The darkness of the woods stretched before him, an endless sea of shadows that seemed to reach out, trying to pull him back. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the air itself was growing denser, more suffocating. The whisper was still there, persistent, haunting. Come. It was no longer just a word. It was a weight, pressing down on him, a force he couldn't escape. He stumbled over roots and rocks, his paws scraped and raw, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The night had swallowed the moon, leaving only an oppressive blackness around him. Each breath felt colder, each step more laborious, as though the forest itself was fighting him, drawing him back toward the house, toward the thing in the shadows. Come. It was closer now, the whisper in his ear, like a chill breath against his skin. Pooh's fur stood on end, his heart hammering in his chest, but he couldn't stop running. Not yet. The trees seemed to bend toward him, their gnarled branches twisting as if they were trying to entangle him, to trap him in their grasp. The darkness around him felt alive, moving, shifting with every step he took. He glanced over his shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. There was nothing, but the feeling of being followed never left. The whisper didn't stop, though. "Come." It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees, filling the air with its chilling command. Pooh's mind raced. What was it? What did it want? He had no answers, only the gnawing sense that he was being pulled towards something terrible, something he couldn't understand. His paws ached, his legs were stiff, but he couldn't stop. The woods had become a labyrinth, twisting around him, turning into something unrecognizable, as though the very land itself had turned against him. The shadow was close now, a dark figure that seemed to slither through the trees, following him in the corners of his vision. He could feel it, its cold presence just behind him, waiting for him to falter. The whisper didn't cease. "Come." Pooh's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind was spinning, caught in a whirlpool of fear, unable to make sense of what was happening. And then, just as he thought he could go no further, the ground beneath him gave way. With a startled cry, Pooh tumbled forward, his body crashing to the cold, hard ground. His head spun, disoriented, his body bruised and aching from the fall. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of the world spinning around him. But there was no time to rest. He could feel it again, the shadow creeping closer, surrounding him. The air was thick with the whisper, more urgent now, pressing into his mind, wrapping around his very thoughts. "Come." Pooh forced himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no stopping now. He had to run. He had to escape. But where? The forest, once familiar, now felt like a maze, each turn leading him deeper into its suffocating darkness. He looked around, but all he saw were the twisted trees, the empty expanse of blackness, and the shadow closing in, its presence growing heavier. And then, from somewhere in the distance, he heard it. A voice, a soft, familiar voice calling his name. Pooh. It was Eeyore. Pooh's heart skipped a beat, hope flickering in his chest. "Eeyore!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Eeyore, help!" But the woods swallowed his words, and the whisper came again, louder, sharper. "Come." Pooh felt a chill rise in his chest, the cold air pressing against him like a wall. No one was coming. Not for him. Not now. The presence was closing in, suffocating him with its icy grip. And as Pooh turned toward the darkness, the forest seemed to dissolve around him, leaving only the shadows, the whisper, and the crushing weight of the cold that had already consumed him. Pooh stumbled, his breath shallow and ragged, his legs refusing to carry him further. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, and the whisper echoed through the trees, relentless. "Come." It wasn't a command anymore. It was an inevitability. The cold air wrapped around him like a vice, squeezing the last ounce of strength from his trembling body. He wanted to scream, to call out, but his throat was too tight, his voice lost in the oppressive silence of the night. The shadows had grown thicker, darker, until it felt as if the very woods were closing in on him, suffocating him with their heavy presence. He turned in circles, disoriented, but everywhere he looked, the same consuming blackness surrounded him. The world had become a twisted reflection of itself, an endless void where nothing felt real. Then, through the thick fog of his panic, a figure appeared before him. At first, he thought it was just another shadow, another trick of the night. But as it stepped closer, Pooh's heart sank. It was not a familiar shape. It was a dark, shifting form, tall and distorted, its edges rippling as if it were made of the very darkness itself. The air around it was colder than anything Pooh had ever felt, and the whisper grew louder, almost deafening. Come. It wasn't Eeyore. It wasn't anyone he knew. It was something else, something far older, far more sinister. Pooh froze, unable to move, his mind screaming at him to run, to flee, but his body remained still, rooted to the spot by some unseen force. The figure stepped closer, and Pooh could feel the cold seeping into his very bones. It was as if the creature was pulling the warmth from him, draining him, leaving nothing but fear in its wake. The whisper turned into a growl, deep and guttural, reverberating in the air around them. Come. The ground beneath Pooh's paws began to crack, and he felt the earth shift, as though the forest itself was alive, moving with its own will. The trees groaned, bending in unnatural ways, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab him. The shadows twisted and writhed, dancing around the figure, pulling Pooh toward it. He tried to scream, but his voice was caught in his throat. No matter how hard he fought, his limbs refused to obey him. The darkness was swallowing him whole. And then, the figure reached out, a dark hand extended toward Pooh. He could feel the icy touch, cold as the deepest winter, brushing against his fur. The moment it made contact, something inside him snapped. A sharp, piercing pain shot through his chest, like his heart was being ripped from him. The whisper was no longer just a sound. It was in his mind, in his soul. Come. And in that moment, Pooh knew the truth. The shadow wasn't just following him. It had been with him all along. It had been waiting, watching, calling him, until now, when it was finally ready to take him into its darkness. The cold was too much to bear, and as his vision began to fade, the last thing he heard was the whisper, now a final, chilling command. Come. Pooh's entire body tensed as the darkness pressed in on him, an overwhelming weight, suffocating and cold. His fur prickled as the shadow's hand, now an unrelenting force, closed around him. It was as though every part of his being was being drained, pulled into something far older, far more powerful than anything he could comprehend. The pain in his chest surged again, sharp and burning, as if the very essence of his heart was being torn from him. For a brief, fleeting moment, he tried to push back, to claw his way out of this nightmare, but his strength was failing. The whisper, that haunting, unrelenting voice, swirled in his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. Come. It was no longer just a sound. It was part of him, his very soul vibrating with its call. His vision blurred, darkness taking over the edges of his sight, until all that was left was that cold, terrifying presence. But then, just as the world seemed to slip away entirely, something inside Pooh fought back. A flicker of warmth, a small but defiant spark of life, rose from deep within him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He could still feel his heart beating, weak as it was, still alive. He gasped, pulling a shaky breath through his chest, forcing his legs to move, to take him somewhere, anywhere, but away from the shadow. He lurched forward, the grip on him loosening for just a moment, and he seized the opportunity. With all the strength he could muster, Pooh pushed himself to his feet, stumbling, nearly falling, but refusing to give in. The shadow screeched in frustration, its cold hand retracting, but Pooh could still feel the dark presence swirling around him, following, waiting for the right moment to strike again. He couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. Pooh's paws carried him through the dark woods, each step feeling like it was taking him deeper into the heart of the nightmare. The trees were twisted, their branches like skeletal hands, clawing at the air, trying to ensnare him. But Pooh didn't look back. He couldn't. The wind howled through the forest, and the whisper still echoed, distant but persistent. "Come." Pooh ran on, his breath shallow and ragged, his mind spinning with confusion and fear. He was beyond exhaustion, every muscle in his body screaming for rest, but the shadow wasn't done with him yet. It had him, and it wasn't going to let him go. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the very ground beneath him seeming to twist and shift, making it impossible to find his way. The darkness was endless. Every step he took only seemed to lead him deeper into it. And then, through the haze of terror that clouded his mind, Pooh saw a flicker of light in the distance. A soft glow, faint but unmistakable. Hope surged through him, a fragile, fleeting thing, but it was enough. With all the strength he had left, Pooh pushed toward the light, forcing his legs to carry him, feeling the weight of the shadow growing closer with each passing second. His heart hammered in his chest, his body shaking with fatigue and fear, but he reached the light. And in that instant, everything stopped. The whisper fell silent. The coldness that had clung to him receded, like a wave retreating from the shore. The dark figure, the shadow that had been chasing him, was gone. Pooh stood, panting, at the edge of a clearing. The glow was warm and soft, like the light of 1,000 stars combined, and it wrapped around him like a protective shield. For the first time since it all began, Pooh felt safe. The shadow had retreated. The woods were still. He had escaped. But deep inside him, Pooh knew that the shadow wasn't truly gone. It was still out there waiting. And it would come again. Pooh stood at the edge of the clearing, his heart still pounding in his chest. The light around him flickered gently, a comforting warmth that wrapped him in its embrace. He could hardly believe he had escaped. The shadow was gone for now. But there was something deep in his gut, a gnawing feeling that the battle wasn't over. The peace he felt in the light was fleeting, fragile. He couldn't ignore the cold that still lingered in his bones, the echo of that awful whisper still reverberating in his mind. "Come." It was distant now, but it wasn't gone. The air felt still, unnervingly still, and Pooh could hear the distant rustling of leaves, the soft murmur of the wind through the trees. But it wasn't enough to calm him. The weight of the shadow still pressed against him, its presence lingering like a dark cloud on the horizon, waiting, patient, like a predator watching its prey. He swallowed hard, fighting the dread that was slowly creeping back into his mind. But even as he tried to steady himself, the sense of unease began to build again. The trees around the clearing seemed to close in, their twisted branches casting strange, shifting shadows across the ground. Pooh took a step forward, his paws tentative, unsure. It was as though the very earth beneath him was shifting, pulling him back toward the darkness. His paws dug into the soft soil as he took another step, his body trembling from the effort. And then, just as his footfall echoed through the quiet, the whisper returned. It wasn't a faint call anymore. It was louder, closer, growing more insistent. "Come." Pooh froze, his fur standing on end. The light, the warmth, it was fading. He could feel it slipping away, like sand through his fingers. His breath quickened, panic rising in his chest. He turned, scanning the clearing, looking for the source of the whisper, but there was nothing except the darkness creeping around the edges of the light. "Come." This time, the voice was unmistakable. It was calling to him. The warmth of the light no longer felt safe. It felt like a trap. The very air seemed to shift, becoming thick, heavy, and suffocating. The ground beneath Pooh's paws felt like it was trembling, shaking with an unseen force. He wanted to run, to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the whisper kept coming. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was something that was inside him, inside his thoughts, worming its way into his very soul. He couldn't escape it. He had to go. But go where? Where could he run from something that followed him everywhere? The light flickered once more, dimming for just a moment, and in that brief darkness, Pooh saw it. A figure, looming in the shadows. Tall, shifting, its edges blurring like smoke, stretching toward him. It was the shadow. It had returned. The darkness had found him again. And this time, there would be no escape. Pooh's heart stopped for a moment as the figure materialized from the shifting shadows, its form dark and twisted, stretching impossibly tall. The air around him grew colder, and the whisper, once distant, now filled his mind like 1,000 voices. "Come." Pooh's legs wobbled beneath him, his body frozen in terror, as the shadow loomed closer, its presence suffocating, filling the clearing with its icy, oppressive weight. The light that had once felt like safety was now a flickering ember, its warmth dissipating with every beat of his racing heart. The trees around him bent in unnatural ways, their branches reaching out like clawed hands, as if they too were part of the dark figure that encroached upon him. Pooh could feel his chest tightening, his breath shallow and panicked, as the figure's shadow seemed to wrap around him, closing in from every angle. He wanted to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey him. The darkness was too strong, too consuming. It was as though the very earth beneath him had become alive with its own malice, and each breath he took felt heavier, as if the air itself was trying to choke him. "Come." The voice was now a low, guttural growl, vibrating through his bones. Pooh's paws trembled, his fur standing on end as the shadow closed the distance between them. He could feel the cold, so cold that it burned. It gnawed at his very soul, pulling him toward it with an invisible force, urging him to surrender. The ground beneath him shifted again, and suddenly he found himself taking a step forward, his body moving against his will. No, no. Pooh fought to regain control, to break free from the pull, but it was futile. The shadow was too powerful. It had him. He could feel it now, pressing against his chest, as if it were trying to drag him into the very earth itself. Come. The voice was right in his ear, as if the shadow had entered his mind, filling it completely. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, a demand. His heart raced, panic flooding his thoughts as his body continued to move, step by step, closer to the figure, closer to the cold, suffocating darkness. The clearing, the light, everything that had seemed so real just moments ago now felt like a distant dream, slipping away, fading into nothing. Pooh's mind screamed for him to wake up, to escape, but it was too late. The shadow reached out a hand, a long, dark tendril that seemed to stretch toward him like a claw. It brushed against his fur, and in that instant, Pooh felt a shock so cold, so sharp, it seemed to pierce his very soul. He could feel the shadow inside him now, its cold grip consuming everything, suffocating him, erasing him. Pooh's vision began to blur, his body growing numb, his mind slipping into the abyss. Come. The voice echoed one last time, a final, terrible call. And then, nothing. The light was gone. The woods, the darkness, all of it vanished into the void. Pooh was left alone, suspended in an eternal emptiness, with only the cold and the silence around him. The shadow had taken him, and this time it would never let go. In the endless void, there was no sense of time, no space, just the suffocating weight of silence pressing against Pooh's mind. He was no longer in the woods, no longer in the clearing or anywhere he recognized. Everything had melted away, leaving him alone in an infinite, cold emptiness. The shadows that once pursued him were gone, but their presence lingered, curling around his thoughts like a thick fog. Pooh couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think clearly. His mind felt fragmented, as though pieces of him were slipping away into the blackness. But somewhere, in the deepest part of his being, there was a flicker of recognition. A memory, a feeling. He wasn't truly alone. He didn't know how, but he could sense something familiar, something gentle and warm, like a distant ember calling to him in the darkness. He grasped at it, clinging to it like a lifeline, pulling it closer, trying to hold on to whatever shred of hope was left. For a moment, the darkness seemed to pull back, just slightly, as though it was aware of this flicker, this resistance. And then, from the depths of the nothingness, a voice broke through. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, like the rustling of leaves in a quiet breeze. Pooh. The voice was familiar. It was Eeyore. Pooh's heart leaped, despite the numbness that still clung to him. Eeyore's voice had always been a comfort, even in the darkest of times. He strained to hear it again, desperately wanting to hold on to the feeling of warmth that Eeyore's presence always brought. Pooh. This time, the voice was clearer, stronger, and it seemed to pierce through the suffocating void that surrounded him. Pooh tried to call out, to reach for his friend, but his voice wouldn't come. His mouth felt frozen, his body a lifeless shell. But then, in the darkness, something else happened. The air around him began to change. The oppressive weight that had been crushing him began to lift, and a faint glow appeared in the distance. At first, it was just a flicker, barely noticeable, but then it grew brighter, stronger. The light began to spread, pushing back against the blackness, casting long shadows that stretched toward Pooh, like hands reaching to pull him free. The warmth of the light wrapped around him, embracing him, reminding him of a time before all this, before the shadows, before the darkness. The whispering presence, the oppressive weight, began to fade, retreating into the corners of his mind, losing its power as the light grew brighter. The glow was now unmistakable, a golden warmth that filled the space around him, bright and radiant, like the first rays of morning after a long night. Pooh felt his body shift, his paws beginning to move, as if the light was guiding him, urging him forward. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Pooh felt himself breathing again. His limbs were no longer frozen. He could move. Slowly, cautiously, he took a step forward, and with each movement, the darkness retreated farther, as if the light was pushing it away. Pooh. The voice came again, clearer now, and Pooh knew it wasn't just in his mind. It was real. It was Eeyore. Pooh's heart swelled with a mix of relief and joy as he followed the light, moving toward the warmth, toward the voice. He didn't know how, but he knew he wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, the darkness had lost its hold on him. Pooh moved forward, each step lighter, as if the weight of the world had begun to lift from his shoulders. The soft, golden light grew stronger with every motion, enveloping him in a gentle embrace. It was as though the darkness that had been choking him for so long had finally reached its limit, unable to withstand the pure warmth of this light. Pooh felt the familiar pull of friendship, of Eeyore's quiet, steady presence, and it gave him strength. Pooh. The voice was now unmistakable. Eeyore, with his comforting tone, was close. Pooh's heart raced with both relief and wonder, and he followed the sound of his friend's voice, trusting that the light would guide him to safety. The forest, once dark and threatening, had started to change. The twisted trees that had once seemed so threatening now stood tall and solid, their branches no longer gnarled and menacing, but soft and welcoming. The ground beneath Pooh's paws was solid again, no longer shifting and unstable. It felt familiar. It felt like home. Finally, Pooh saw him. Eeyore stood a few steps away, his familiar figure outlined by the warm glow. His gray coat looked soft under the light, his somber expression still present, but there was something different about him now, something hopeful. Eeyore's eyes softened as he saw Pooh, and he slowly walked toward him, the light around them both growing stronger with every step. "There you are," Eeyore murmured, his voice low but full of warmth. "I knew you'd make it." Pooh could hardly believe his eyes. There was Eeyore, the same friend he had always known, but now in a place that felt like a dream. His heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of relief, but there was something else, something deeper. The shadow that had haunted him, that oppressive force that had followed him for so long, was gone. It had dissolved, retreating into nothingness as the light around them grew brighter. Eeyore reached out with a hoof, and Pooh, his legs still weak from the ordeal, staggered forward to meet him. Eeyore's touch was gentle, comforting, and in that moment, Pooh felt the last of his fear melt away. The darkness, the cold, the shadows, they were all gone. And in their place was peace. "How did you?" Pooh began, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you find me?" Eeyore gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I didn't find you," he said quietly. "I never left you. I was always here, waiting." Pooh stared at him, his mind struggling to comprehend it all. He had felt so alone, so lost, and yet Eeyore had been right there, beside him, in a way he couldn't have imagined. The warmth of the light seemed to settle around them, filling the space with an undeniable sense of calm. Pooh let out a deep breath, his chest finally free of the suffocating weight that had gripped him for so long. "You saved me," Pooh whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. Eeyore nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I didn't save you," he said. "You saved yourself. You just had to find the courage to step into the light." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Pooh understood. He wasn't alone, not truly. Even in the darkest moments, there was always a way back into the light. And with Eeyore beside him, he knew that no shadow could ever swallow him whole. Not again. Not ever. Pooh stood beside Eeyore, feeling the comforting warmth of their shared space. The light, once so distant, now seemed to envelop them both, wrapping them in a soft glow that radiated peace. It was a feeling Pooh had long forgotten, peace without fear, without the haunting shadows that had chased him for so long. For the first time in what felt like ages, Pooh felt whole again. He looked at Eeyore, his somber but kind friend, and realized how much he had missed the quiet presence of those who cared for him. "Thank you," Pooh said softly, his voice filled with gratitude, almost embarrassed by the depth of emotion he was feeling. "You didn't have to do anything," Eeyore replied with a soft sigh. "I just waited like always." "You'll find your way back, Pooh." "You always do." Pooh nodded, feeling a quiet sense of warmth settle deep within his chest. He looked around the glowing clearing, the once threatening forest now replaced with gentle trees, bathed in soft light. Everything was calm, still, as though the world had righted itself. "Where do we go now?" Pooh asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Eeyore didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was steady and calm. "We go where we need to," Eeyore said. "We go where the light is, where the warmth is. And we'll keep going as long as it keeps us together." Pooh smiled. He didn't need to say anything more. He understood. Together, they had found their way out of the darkness. Together, they would keep moving forward. The shadows that had once loomed so large were nothing now. They had no power here. The light, their light, would protect them. And with each step they took, they would walk together, free from fear, from the cold, from the darkness that had once seemed endless. In this moment, Pooh knew the truth. No matter how deep the shadows went, the light and the warmth of friendship would always be enough to find his way home. And so, hand in hoof, Pooh and Eeyore walked forward, the glowing path stretching out before them, leading them to a new day, to a future filled with nothing but peace. For as long as they stayed close, the darkness could never reach them again. The shadow was gone. The warmth had returned. And together, they would always be safe. The light around Pooh and Eeyore grew brighter, and as they walked together, they felt the weight of everything that had happened slowly fade away. The dark forest they had left behind seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the gentle glow of a world that felt safer, warmer. Pooh could hardly believe it. After all the fear, all the shadows, they had found their way back to something pure, something real. Still, as the two friends walked, side by side, the soft glow never wavered. It filled every inch of the space, illuminating the path ahead, and yet there was a quiet weight that lingered, as if a part of Pooh's heart still felt the pull of the dark. The shadows were gone. Of that, he was certain. But deep within, he knew something had changed forever. "You know," Pooh said after a long pause, his voice soft but steady, "I never thought I'd make it out. I didn't think there would be an end to it all." Eeyore looked at him, his usual melancholy expression softening, but he didn't say anything at first. The silence between them was comforting, like two old friends sitting in quiet understanding. Finally, Eeyore spoke, his words calm and thoughtful. "Sometimes, Pooh, you don't have to see the end to know it's coming. You just have to trust the journey." He looked up at the glowing trees, their leaves shimmering like stars. "It's not about what we face. It's about who we have beside us when we face it." Pooh smiled at that, the weight in his chest lightening. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words until now. Together, they had weathered the storm. Together, they had conquered the shadow. The clearing ahead was growing wider, the light spreading to reveal a new world, untouched and full of promise. A world where peace lived, where warmth wrapped around everything like a soft blanket. And as Pooh walked forward, with Eeyore beside him, he knew that no matter what came next, they were stronger together. No darkness, no matter how overwhelming, could ever take that away. The journey had brought them here to this quiet, unspoken promise that no matter where the road led, they would always find their way together. As Pooh and Eeyore continued their walk, the glow around them began to soften, not fading, but settling into a gentle, steady light, like the last rays of the sun before dusk. The trees that had once seemed so threatening now stood tall and firm, their branches reaching toward the sky in a peaceful, silent greeting. The path ahead stretched out before them, winding gently through the forest, no longer shrouded in fear, but bathed in a quiet, comforting warmth. For the first time in a long while, Pooh felt at ease. The unsettling whispers, the shadow that had haunted him, were no more. All that remained was the serene companionship of Eeyore, the trust they shared, and the peace that filled the world around them. They didn't speak much as they walked, content simply in the presence of one another. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was full of understanding. A shared acknowledgement of the journey they had been through, of the darkness they had both faced, and of the strength they had found in each other. Pooh's heart felt light, as though every step was taking him further from the shadows and closer to something lasting. The path before them was no longer uncertain, for they both knew now that no matter where it led, they would face it together. There was comfort in that truth, something deep and unshakable. As they walked on, the world around them seemed to brighten ever so slightly, as if the very earth was rejoicing in their newfound peace. The forest, once dark and mysterious, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where light and shadow coexisted in harmony, no longer a source of fear, but a reminder of the balance of life. And as the last of the day's light began to fade into the soft hues of evening, Pooh looked up at the sky, his heart full. "Thank you, Eeyore," Pooh said softly, his voice full of gratitude. Eeyore, as always, gave a small, knowing smile, his eyes reflecting the gentle glow around them. "Just doing my part, Pooh," he replied quietly. With that, the two friends walked onward, the path ahead endless, but inviting, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, together, they had already found the greatest light of all. And so, in that quiet moment, the shadows of the past faded away, leaving nothing but the warmth of the present and the promise of all the peaceful tomorrows